The digital clock glows 2:47 a.m. as Julia's eyes flutter open in the darkness. Something feels wrong. She reaches across the cool sheets, her hand finding only empty space where her husband Michael should be. The familiar warmth of his body, the gentle rise and fall of his breathing, all absent. Julia sits up slowly, her heart already beginning to race. In their 15 years of marriage, Michael has always been a deep sleeper, practically glued to his side of the bed until the alarm jolts him awake at 6:30 sharp. She strains her ears, listening for the sound of running water or footsteps, but the house remains eerily silent. Their life together has fallen into such predictable patterns. Every morning, Michael kisses her forehead before heading to his job at the insurance firm downtown. Every evening, he returns home by 6:15, loosens his tie, and asks about her day while she finishes preparing dinner. They eat together, watch the news, and retreat to their respective evening routines, her with a book, him with his laptop, supposedly catching up on work emails. But lately, something has shifted. Julia noticed it first 3 weeks ago when Michael started staying up later, claiming he had urgent reports to finish. His laptop screen would illuminate his face with an artificial glow, and whenever she approached, he'd quickly minimize whatever he was working on. "Just boring insurance stuff," he'd say with a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then came the phone calls. Hushed conversations that ended abruptly when she entered the room. "Work again," he'd explain, but his voice carried a tension she'd never heard before. Yesterday morning, she'd tried to address it directly. "Michael, is everything okay at the office? You seem stressed lately." He'd paused while buttering his toast, his movements suddenly rigid. "Everything's fine, Julia. Just a busy period. You know how it is." But she didn't know how it was. In 15 years, Michael had never brought this kind of secretive energy into their home. The man who used to share every detail of his day, who'd complain about difficult clients and celebrate small victories, had become guarded, distant. Now, sitting alone in their bed, Julia's mind races through possibilities. Maybe he couldn't sleep and went downstairs to read. Maybe he's in the bathroom and she simply didn't hear him get up. There has to be a logical explanation. She swings her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. The house feels different at night, larger somehow, filled with shadows and unfamiliar sounds. As she stands, she notices Michael's phone isn't on his nightstand where he always places it before bed. His wallet is missing too. Julia moves quietly toward the bedroom door, her silk nightgown rustling softly with each step. The hallway stretches before her, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the window at the far end. She pauses at the top of the stairs, listening intently. Is that the sound of a car engine outside? Her pulse quickens as she realizes it's coming from their driveway. But Michael's car should be in the garage. She knows because she saw him park it there when he came home from work yesterday evening. Julia's hand trembles slightly as she reaches for the door handle of their bedroom. Every instinct tells her to crawl back under the covers, to wait until morning and pretend this never happened. But she can't ignore the growing certainty that something is very wrong. The floorboard creaks beneath her feet as she takes another step toward the window that overlooks their front yard. Her heart pounds so loudly she's certain it must be audible throughout the house. She presses her face against the cool glass, peering through the darkness. There, parked at the curb instead of in their driveway, sits Michael's silver sedan. The engine is running, exhaust visible in the cold night air. But it's not Michael behind the wheel. Julia's breath catches in her throat as she recognizes the figure in the driver's seat. It's a woman, young, with long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Even in the dim streetlight, Julia can see that she's beautiful, probably in her 20s. The woman is looking toward their house, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone screen. As Julia watches in frozen horror, the front door of her house opens quietly, and Michael steps outside, moving with the careful stealth of someone who doesn't want to be heard. Julia's heart pounds as she stares at the scene before her. Her husband Michael stands in their kitchen at 2 a.m, completely dressed, holding a packed duffel bag. He's not alone. Their neighbor Mrs. Chen from across the street sits at their kitchen table, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Julia, I can explain," Michael says, his voice barely above a whisper. But the words hang in the air like a confession she's not ready to hear. The discovery sends Julia's world tilting. She stumbles backward, her mind racing through the past few months. The late-night phone calls Michael claimed were work emergencies. The way he'd grown distant during dinner conversations. The subtle changes in his routine that she'd dismissed as stress from his job at the insurance firm. "I knew something was wrong," she whispers, more to herself than to them. "I just knew it." Mrs. Chen looks up at Julia with apologetic eyes. "I'm so sorry, dear. I didn't want to involve you, but Michael insisted we tell you together." Julia's hands shake as she wraps her robe tighter around herself. 23 years of marriage, and she's standing in her own kitchen feeling like a stranger in her own life. She thinks about their daughter Sarah, away at college, blissfully unaware that her parents' seemingly stable world might be crumbling. "Tell me what exactly?" Julia's voice cracks. "What are you two doing here in the middle of the night?" Michael sets down the duffel bag and takes a step toward her. "Mrs. Chen's husband, he's been threatening her. Getting violent. She called me tonight because she was scared, and I..." "You what?" Julia interrupts, her fear transforming into something sharper. "You decided to play hero without telling your wife?" The kitchen falls silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Julia realizes this moment crystallizes everything she's been feeling but couldn't name. The growing distance. The sense that Michael was living a parallel life she wasn't part of. The feeling that she'd become invisible in her own marriage. "I volunteer at the women's shelter downtown," Mrs. Chen says quietly. "Michael's been helping us with insurance claims for victims of domestic violence. He's been doing it for months, pro bono." Julia blinks, trying to process this information. "The women's shelter?" "I couldn't tell you," Michael says, his voice heavy with guilt. "Client confidentiality, legal issues." "But tonight, when Mrs. Chen called and said her husband was drunk and threatening her with a knife, I couldn't just sit there." Julia looks between them, her emotions churning. Relief that her husband isn't having an affair wars with anger that he's been keeping such a significant part of his life secret from her. She thinks about all the evenings she'd spent alone, wondering if their marriage was falling apart, when in reality, Michael had been helping other women put their lives back together. "So this is what you've been doing," she says slowly. "All those late nights, the phone calls, the way you've been so distant." Michael nods, shame written across his face. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid you'd worry, or that you'd want to get involved and put yourself in danger." "That's not your decision to make," Julia says, her voice gaining strength. "I'm your wife, Michael. We're supposed to be partners." Mrs. Chen stands up from the table, clutching a tissue. "I should go. I've caused enough trouble between you two." "No," Julia says firmly, surprising herself. "You're not going anywhere. If your husband is threatening you, you're staying here tonight. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." She looks at Michael, seeing him clearly for the first time in months. Not as the stranger who'd been pulling away from her, but as the man she married. The man who would leave his bed at 2 in the morning to help a neighbor in crisis. "But we're going to talk," she tells him. "About all of this. About why you felt you couldn't trust me with something so important." Michael nods, relief flickering across his features. "I know. I'm sorry, Julia. I really am." As Mrs. Chen settles back into her chair, Julia moves to put the kettle on for tea. But as she reaches for the cabinet, she notices something else. On the counter, partially hidden under some papers, is a manila envelope addressed to Michael. The return address makes her blood run cold. It's from a law firm she doesn't recognize, and stamped across the front in red letters are the words, "Urgent Restraining Order Violation." Julia's hand freezes on the kettle handle. Whatever Michael has gotten himself into, it's bigger than just helping neighbors. And as she looks at the envelope, she realizes their night of revelations has only just begun. Julia's hands trembled as she gripped her coffee mug, the ceramic growing cold against her palms. 3 days had passed since she'd found David's office empty at midnight, and his explanation about the emergency board meeting felt increasingly hollow with each passing hour. She'd replayed their conversation dozens of times, analyzing every pause, every glance away from her eyes. "You're being paranoid," she whispered to herself, but the words carried no conviction. The doorbell's chime cut through her spiraling thoughts. Through the peephole, she spotted her neighbor Margaret holding a casserole dish, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early morning hour. "I brought you some of my famous tuna noodle casserole," Margaret announced as Julia opened the door. "You've seemed so stressed lately, dear." Julia forced a smile, accepting the warm dish. "Thank you, Margaret. That's very thoughtful." Margaret's keen eyes studied Julia's face with the practiced concern of someone who'd raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands. "Honey, you look like you haven't slept in days. Is everything all right with you and David?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Julia felt her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. "I found something," Julia heard herself say, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "The other night, David wasn't in bed. I found his office empty, and there was this letter on his desk. It was from someone named Sarah, and it mentioned meeting times and keeping things secret." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "Did you ask him about it?" "He said it was business. A client who needed confidentiality." Julia's voice grew smaller. "But Margaret, I've been married to this man for 12 years. I know when he's lying." Margaret set down her purse and guided Julia to the living room sofa. "What does your gut tell you?" Julia's throat constricted. "That everything I thought I knew about my marriage is falling apart." The admission hung between them like a physical weight. Julia realized she'd been carrying this fear for months, maybe even years. The late nights David claimed were work-related, the mysterious phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room, the way he'd grown distant during their conversations about starting a family. "I keep thinking about our anniversary dinner last month," Julia continued, tears threatening to spill. "He was distracted the entire evening. Kept checking his phone. When I asked him about it, he got defensive and said I was being clingy." Margaret reached over and squeezed Julia's hand. "Have you considered that there might be an innocent explanation? I want to believe that. God, I want to believe that so badly." Julia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But what if I'm just being naive? What if I've been naive this whole time?" The sound of David's key in the front door made both women freeze. Julia quickly composed herself, smoothing her hair and straightening her shoulders as footsteps approached the living room. "Morning, ladies," David said, his voice carrying forced cheerfulness. He was dressed in his running gear, sweat beading on his forehead, but Julia noticed he wasn't breathing particularly hard. "David," Margaret nodded politely. "I was just bringing Julia some comfort food. She's been feeling under the weather." David's eyes flicked to Julia, and she caught something there, a flash of guilt, or perhaps weariness. "Is that right? You didn't mention feeling sick this morning." "It's nothing serious," Julia managed, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Just tired." David moved to the kitchen, and Julia heard him rummaging through cabinets. When he returned, he was holding his phone, his expression troubled. "I have to run out for a bit," he announced. "Something's come up at the office." "On Saturday?" The question escaped before Julia could stop it. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's important, Julia. I'll explain later." As the front door closed behind him, Julia felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The man she'd married, the man she'd planned her entire future around, was becoming a stranger before her eyes. Margaret's voice cut through her thoughts. "Julia, there's something you need to know. I've seen David's car parked on Maple Street several times this week. That's nowhere near his office." Julia's heart began to race. Maple Street was in the old part of town, lined with quaint coffee shops and boutique stores. It was also where Sarah Mitchell lived, the same Sarah whose letter she'd found. "Are you sure?" Julia whispered. Margaret nodded grimly. "I'm sure. And honey, I think it's time you found out what's really going on." Julia stared at the door David had just walked through, her mind racing with possibilities, each one more devastating than the last. The community fundraiser she'd been organizing suddenly felt trivial compared to the earthquake threatening to destroy her marriage. She was about to discover that some secrets, once unearthed, change everything forever. Julia's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the black leather. The community center's parking lot stretched before her, half empty in the late afternoon sun. She'd driven here on autopilot, her mind racing with everything she'd discovered over the past few days. The lies, the secrets, the growing certainty that her marriage was built on foundations she'd never even known existed. She pulled into a spot near the back, away from the main entrance. Through the windows, she could see the familiar bustle of volunteers preparing for tomorrow's charity auction. Just last week, she'd been one of them, enthusiastically sorting donations and arranging display tables. Now, everything felt different. Even this place, where she'd found purpose and community, seemed tainted by the knowledge that her husband had been living a double life. Her phone buzzed. A text from David, "Running late tonight. Don't wait up." Julia stared at the message, her chest tightening. Another lie. She knew exactly where he'd be tonight, and it wasn't at the office like he'd claimed this morning. The private investigator's photos were still burned into her memory, David entering that downtown apartment building, the same one 3 nights in a row. She stepped out of the car, smoothing her dress with shaking hands. The community center's double doors felt heavier than usual as she pushed them open. The familiar scent of coffee and industrial carpet hit her, but instead of comfort, it brought a wave of nausea. "Julia." Margaret's voice carried across the lobby. "Thank goodness you're here. We need to talk about the silent auction layout." Julia forced a smile, walking toward the older woman who'd become both mentor and friend over the past year. Margaret's gray hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed a clipboard. "Margaret, I actually need to ask you something," Julia said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's about David." Margaret's expression shifted, the warmth in her eyes replaced by something more guarded. "Oh? You know him better than I realized, don't you?" Julia's question hung in the air between them. The older woman set down her clipboard, glancing around the busy lobby before gesturing toward a quieter corner. "Julia, dear, what's brought this on?" "I found out about the apartment," Julia said quietly. "The one on 5th Street. I know he's been going there." Margaret's face went pale. She reached for Julia's arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "Sit down, honey. Please." They settled into 2 folding chairs near the back wall, away from the other volunteers. Margaret's hands fidgeted with her clipboard, her usual composure cracking. "How long have you known?" Julia asked. "About 6 months," Margaret admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw him there by accident. I was visiting my sister in that building, and I saw him in the elevator." Julia's heart pounded. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's not what you think," Margaret said quickly. "Julia, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you, but David made me promise to let him handle it. He said he was protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" Julia's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby volunteers. She lowered it again. "From the truth about his affair?" Margaret's eyes widened. "Affair? Oh, honey, no. That's not, Julia, the apartment isn't for him. It's for someone else. Someone who needed help." Confusion washed over Julia. "What do you mean?" "Your husband has been paying for that apartment for his brother," Margaret said gently. "Michael's been living there since he got out of rehab. David didn't want you to know because he was ashamed. Ashamed that his brother was struggling again, ashamed that he felt he had to hide it from you." The words hit Julia like a physical blow. "Michael. David's younger brother, who'd battled addiction for years. She'd always liked him, but David had grown distant whenever his brother's name came up. She'd assumed it was because Michael had stopped visiting, stopped calling. But the secrecy, Julia whispered. The lies about working late. He's been taking Michael to meetings, Margaret continued. Helping him find work. David's been terrified that if you knew Michael was using again, you'd think less of him. Of his family. Julia felt the world shifting beneath her feet. All her assumptions, all her fears about betrayal and infidelity, crumbling in the face of this new information. I need to see him, she said, standing abruptly. I need to go to that apartment. Margaret caught her arm. Julia, wait. David specifically asked me not to tell you because he wanted to handle this himself. He's been trying to get Michael stable enough to tell you the truth. But Julia was already moving toward the door, her mind reeling. She'd been so focused on her own hurt, her own assumptions, that she'd never considered there might be another explanation. The late nights, the secret of phone calls, the distant look in David's eyes, it all made sense now. She pushed through the community center doors into the fading daylight, her keys already in her hand. The drive to 5th Street took 20 minutes of her heart racing and her mind spinning with everything she thought she knew versus everything she was learning. The apartment building was a modest brick structure, nothing like the romantic rendezvous spot she'd imagined. Julia parked across the street, staring up at the windows. One on the 3rd floor had a soft light glowing behind thin curtains. She crossed the street on unsteady legs, her finger hovering over the buzzer for apartment 3B. Before she could press it, the building's front door opened, and David stepped out, looking exhausted. Behind him, she caught a glimpse of Michael, thinner than she remembered, but definitely him. David's eyes met hers across the small vestibule, and she saw something she'd been too hurt to notice before, not guilt over an affair, but the deep shame of a man who felt he'd failed his family. Julia, he breathed, and in that single word, she heard years of fear and love and desperate hope that she would understand. But as she opened her mouth to respond, to tell him she did understand, that she was sorry for doubting him, Michael appeared in the doorway behind David. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and when he saw her, his expression crumpled. I'm sorry, Michael whispered, and something in his voice made Julia's blood run cold. I'm so sorry about what I did to your house. Julia's heart pounds as she processes everything that's happened over the past few days. The midnight discovery, the confrontations, the revelations, they all led to this moment of clarity. She realizes that her marriage isn't falling apart, it's evolving into something deeper and more honest than she ever imagined possible. The next morning, Julia wakes up before her alarm, feeling lighter than she has in months. David is still sleeping peacefully beside her, and for the first time in weeks, his presence brings her comfort rather than anxiety. She gently touches his shoulder, and he stirs awake. Good morning, she whispers, her voice soft but steady. Morning, beautiful, he replies, his eyes searching her face. How are you feeling? Julia takes a deep breath. Better. Different. Like I can finally see clearly again. She sits up, pulling her knees to her chest. David, I need to tell you something important. All this time, I thought I was losing you, but I was actually losing myself. I was so afraid of not being enough that I stopped being honest about what I needed. David sits up too, giving her his full attention. What do you mean? I mean that I've been expecting you to read my mind, to know what I needed without me ever asking. And when you didn't, I interpreted it as you not caring. Julia's voice grows stronger. But that's not fair to either of us. I need to be brave enough to ask for what I want instead of hoping you'll guess correctly. David reaches for her hand. I want to hear everything you need, Julia. I want to know how to love you better. Over the next hour, they have the most honest conversation of their marriage. Julia shares her fears about becoming invisible, about losing her identity in their relationship. David opens up about his own insecurities, his worry that he's not successful enough, not present enough. They discover that they've both been carrying burdens alone that were meant to be shared. I have an idea, Julia says, her eyes brightening. What if we made a pact? Every Sunday morning, we sit down together and talk about our week, what we need, what we're grateful for, what we want to work on together. I love that, David agrees immediately. And Julia, I want you to know that your volunteer work at the community center isn't just something you do on the side. It's part of who you are, and I'm proud of the difference you make. Julia feels tears of relief forming. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. Later that afternoon, Julia meets Sarah at their favorite cafe. Her friend immediately notices the change in her demeanor. Okay, spill, Sarah says, setting down her coffee cup. You look like a completely different person than you did 3 days ago. Julia smiles, feeling genuinely happy. I feel like a different person. Sarah, I need to thank you for pushing me to be honest about what I was feeling. If you hadn't challenged me to look deeper, I might have kept spiraling. So what changed? Sarah asks, leaning forward with interest. I realized that I was waiting for David to fix problems I never told him existed. I was testing him in ways that were impossible for him to pass. Julia pauses, choosing her words carefully. I also realized that I've been so focused on what our marriage was missing that I forgot to appreciate what it has. Sarah nods thoughtfully. That's huge, Julia. It takes real courage to admit when we're part of the problem. The crazy thing is, once I started being honest about my needs, David stepped up in ways I never expected. He's not perfect, but he's trying, and that's what matters. That evening, Julia and David attend the community fundraiser together. As Julia mingles with volunteers and donors, she notices David watching her with genuine admiration. When she's giving a speech about the center's impact, she catches his eye and sees nothing but pride and love. After the event, as they walk to their car, David takes her hand. Julia, watching you tonight reminded me of why I fell in love with you in the first place. You have this incredible ability to see the good in people and help them see it in themselves. Julia squeezes his hand. I needed to remember that about myself. And I needed to remember that you see it too. As they drive home, Julia reflects on how dramatically her perspective has shifted. The woman who woke up 3 nights ago, panicked and suspicious, feels like a stranger now. She's learned that trust isn't about blind faith, it's about choosing to believe in someone while also being honest about your own needs and boundaries. David, she says as they pull into their driveway, I want our marriage to be the kind where we can talk about anything, even when it's uncomfortable. Me too, he agrees. And Julia, I promise to pay better attention. Not just to what you say, but to what you might need even when you don't say it. Julia smiles, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. And I promise to actually say it instead of hoping you'll guess. As they prepare for bed that night, Julia realizes that sometimes the most profound changes happen not through dramatic revelations, but through simple acts of courage, the courage to be vulnerable, to ask for what you need, and to trust that love can grow stronger when it's built on honesty rather than assumption. She looks at David brushing his teeth in the bathroom mirror and feels overwhelming gratitude. Not just for him, but for the journey that brought them to this deeper understanding. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but tonight, she goes to sleep knowing that they'll face them together, with open hearts and honest words. The marriage she was afraid of losing has transformed into something even better, a partnership built on truth, mutual respect, and the daily choice to keep growing together.